It was the morning of June 5th, 1967. In the country of Egypt, business carried on as usual. This would not last, however, as foreign aircraft penetrate Egyptian airspace and virtually destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force in one fell swoop. Billows of smoke and the charred remains of aircraft became a common sight at military airfields across the country. Who carried out this surprise attack? Its neighbor and archenemy Israel was responsible. The Six-Day War had officially begun. The Six-Day War was one of the most important wars in Middle Eastern history. As a result of this conflict, Israel would swell in size and the balance of power in the Middle East would shift. Israel's expansion would also come with its own set of issues. But why did Israel attack first? How did the Israelis end up victorious? We must first go back to the painful birth of the State of Israel. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared itself a nation. Immediately, its Arab neighbors banded together and attacked the fledgling country. At the end of this war, however, Israel not only survived, but expanded. Despite their failure to kill Israel at birth, the Arab countries would not be deterred in destroying the Jewish state. The Palestinian Fedayeen insurgency raged for several years after the War of 1948. Palestinian irregulars operating out of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria launched a series of small-scale attacks on Israeli targets. In 1956, Israel, in conjunction with the UK and France, invaded Egypt. The three countries' aims were to retake control of the Suez Canal, which had been nationalized, remove Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, and reopen the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. On the ground, the coalition had won, but international pressure forced them to concede their gains. Nasser was fortunate enough to have been militarily defeated and still emerge victorious. Still, the prospect of another conflagration between the Arabs and the Jews lingered. In May 1967, Egyptian President Nasser expelled the UN peacekeeping force stationed on the Sinai Peninsula since the end of the Suez Crisis of 1956. President Nasser then began to mass troops on the Sinai Peninsula. On May 23, 1967, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. The prevailing feeling in Israel at the time was that the Jewish state was in imminent danger. Israel's top generals were pushing for an immediate preemptive strike. On June 3rd, Meir Amit, the head of Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, returned from a meeting with U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, having received assurances that the U.S. would not object to military action against Nasser. That night, Israel's war planners decided to go to war. During the period between 1956 to 1967, both the Israelis and the Arabs had been preparing for the next war. Egypt had received substantial military aid from the Soviet Union. Egypt's forces on the Sinai Peninsula numbered 100,000. This included nearly 400 aircraft, 900 tanks, 200 assault guns, and 900 artillery pieces. Israel's neighbor Jordan possessed an overall strength of only 55,000. On top of this, Jordan's air force consisted of a handful of subsonic planes and no bombers. Jordan's ground forces included only 100 artillery pieces and 300 tanks. Syria's military was made up of 65,000 troops, 300 tanks, and 300 artillery barrels. There were only about 100 planes in Syria's air force. On the Israeli side, the IDF had 250,000 troops at the ready. 180,000 of these men were reservists. The Israeli Air Force had about 200 modern combat aircraft at their disposal. In addition, Israel had 746 artillery pieces and 1,300 tanks. At the time, the IDF placed a heavy emphasis on the role of armor. Israeli tank crews had become proficient to the point where gunners could hit moving targets from over 2 miles away. Each member of an Israeli tank crew was trained in their teammates' jobs on top of their own, making it easier to take each other's places in the event that a member of the crew is injured. On June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched a surprise attack on Egypt, destroying most of Egypt's military aircraft on the ground and ensuring total Israeli control of the air. Ezer Weizmann, the Israeli commander who orchestrated the attack, exclaimed over the phone that the war had already been won. By the end of the first day, the Israelis had advanced about 30 miles into Egyptian territory. However disorderly the initial Israeli advance may have been, Israeli troops reached the Suez Canal on June 7th. By June 8th, the Israelis were mopping up the last vestiges of Egyptian resistance. King Hussein of Jordan prodded the Israelis with a series of provocative actions such as firing artillery in the general vicinity of Tel Aviv and making half-hearted advances toward Jerusalem. Still, the Israelis mounted an attack on Jordan. On the afternoon of June 5th, the IAF destroyed Jordan's air force on the ground. Israeli paratroopers engaged in a fierce battle with the Jordanian army in the city of Jerusalem. After 36 hours of fighting, the Israelis had defeated the Jordanians. The Israeli paratroopers entered the old city of Jerusalem, uniting the city under Jewish control. On the Syrian front, things did not go as smoothly for the Israelis. Command and control issues and traffic jams, among other things, delayed the IDF's assault on the Golan Heights until June 9th. However, by that evening, Israeli forces had captured a number of important Syrian positions. The IDF paid a high price in blood. Despite the Israeli victory, the Syrian army was still intact, as Brigadier General David Elazar was forced to concede. Israel's success in the Six-Day War was due in large part to the Israeli Air Force, who destroyed the Arab air forces on the ground and relentlessly attacked Arab ground targets. Still, there were glaring weaknesses on the Israeli side. Martin van Creveld wrote, "Still, had the campaign lasted longer, inevitably the pace of operations would have slowed, as aircraft suffered damage or required maintenance, pilots became exhausted, and the like." Israel's over-reliance on tanks and the poor coordination between the armored units and other ground troops were further weaknesses. Martin van Creveld says, "However, the Israelis were reluctant to recognize this shortcoming. Instead, they stuck to the all-tank approach fully 3 decades after it had been abandoned by every other leading army in the world, with grave consequences. On the Arab side, disunity among the Arab states, coordination issues, and insufficient flexibility among the Arab units, among other problems, contributed to their defeat in the Six-Day War. The result of the Six-Day War was greeted with celebration not just in Israel but in the Western world as a whole. For Israel, however, the result of the Six-Day War would instill a fatal sense of invincibility in the IDF. This mentality would cost Israel dearly in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Military historian Martin van Creveld said, "In retrospect, the smashing victory of 1967 was probably the worst thing that ever happened to Israel." He continues with, "And before long they were confronted with new challenges that they found difficult to overcome." Israel would swell in size after the war, creating new national security issues and a refugee crisis. The Six-Day War had significant consequences for the Middle East which are still being felt to this day. While it did bolster Israel's security in the short term, it made her even less secure in the long term. What do you guys think? Was the Six-Day War morally justifiable? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.